The sinking of the RMS Titanic, perhaps the most notorious maritime disaster of history, occurring April 15th, 1912, during its inaugural journey from Southampton to New York City. The Titanic, the largest passenger ship of its era, was considered unsinkable because of its sophisticated safety mechanisms. Nevertheless, we all know the story. It collided with an iceberg in the North Atlantic and was submerged within hours, resulting in the deaths of over 1,500 passengers and crew from the 2,224 aboard. The inadequate lifeboats, along with the absence of appropriate safety training, only intensified the disaster. The catastrophe showed the critical inadequacies in contemporary maritime safety rules, resulting in substantial amendments to international maritime legislation encompassing enhanced safety protocols and lifeboat mandates. More than 100 years on, the tale of the Titanic continues to enthrall us. It's somewhat of a story of human arrogance, new technology, and thinking that we're unbreakable. I think for a long time it will remain a story to be talked about. And today we're not going to talk about everything before the building of the Titanic and everything else. We're just going to jump straight to what you're here for. But first, let me welcome you to the channel. If it's your first time, good to meet you. For those coming back, good to have you again. Do you have some fact about the Titanic that you'd perhaps like to share? Write it in the comments. I'll pin the most interesting one. Perhaps it'll be yours. Who knows? But for now, let's get nice and relaxed. It's going to be a bit of a long one. Well, they're all long ones here, but that's okay. Let's get nice and comfortable. Commissioned on the 2nd of April, 1912, the Titanic was the second of the 3 Olympic-class ocean liners at the time. It was the largest ship in the world. Both Titanic and her sister ship, the RMS Olympic, boasted a gross registered tonnage significantly larger than Cunard's RMS Lusitania and RMS Mauretania, and were about 100 feet longer. It was built to accommodate 3,547 people. The Titanic offered unmatched speed and unmatched luxury, featuring the largest reciprocating engines that were ever constructed up to that date, which were 40 feet tall, and they required 600 long tons of coal per day for the furnaces. First-class accommodations on the Titanic were described as extraordinarily grand, with the most luxurious suites, called parlor suites, costing around $4,350 at the time, which is equivalent to almost $140,000 today for a simple one-way trip across the Atlantic. Even think about it now. There's not too many places that have a price tag like that. But even the third-class accommodations were considered pretty much superior to what many of the passengers were accustomed to. Comfortable quarters, ample food of pretty good quality at that. A pretty good deal for your money. Now on to the Maiden voyage. Now that we've set the scene, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of those who were on the ship. It began just after noon, the 10th of April, 1912, departing from Southampton en route to New York, that promised land, the city where everyone was trying to get in 1912. Well, shortly after setting sail, The Titanic narrowly avoided a conclusion with the anchored liners SS City of New York and Oceanic. Not off to a good start, as its large displacement caused the smaller vessels to actually be lifted up by the surge of water. You see, the mooring cables of the SS City of New York snapped, sending it stern first into the Titanic. Well, towards, rather. However, fortunately they had the little tugboat Vulcan that helped avert a collision, and Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, ordered the engines to reverse. Well, they were quite lucky. The vessels only avoided collision by about 4 feet. Still, the departure was delayed by about 45 minutes. I'm sure all of their bad luck is used up. Well, several hours later, the Titanic arrived at Cherbourg Harbor in northwestern France, a distance of 80 nautical miles, about 148 kilometers, where she embarked in passengers. Now, her subsequent destination was Queenstown, which was now Cobb in Ireland, which she arrived at approximately noon on the 11th of April. She departed in the afternoon after acquiring additional passengers and supplies. And that's something that they never show you. In the movies, they don't show how Titanic made these extra stops. Well, at the time of the Titanic's westward departure across the Atlantic, she had carried 892 crew members and 1,320 passengers, which was about half of her full passenger capacity of 2,435. Now, why was this? Well, it wasn't due to anything about the popularity of the Titanic, nothing to do with that. It was mainly due to it was essentially off-season. There was also these disruptions in UK shipping in general that was caused by a coal miners' strike. And no coal, no ships. Well, Titanic's passengers reflected this broad spectrum of Edwardian society, from the wealthy, such as John Jacob Astor, who was the wealthiest man on the ship. In fact, he had this great mansion in New York. I think it's a synagogue now. They destroyed it and converted it into a synagogue, I believe. You may have to look up the Astor Mansion, but I do believe that's correct. But he was incredibly wealthy. Rockefeller sort of wealthy, you know. And also Benjamin Guggenheim. Around about the same level, but not quite up there with Mr. Astor. But also you had the top level of society and also the bottom level. Those poor emigrants from nations like Armenia, Italy, Sweden, which was quite poor at the time, Ireland, Syria, Russia, all seeking new lives in the United States, probably fingers crossed to be employed by one of Astor or Guggenheim's many companies, perhaps. Now, on to Captain Edward Smith. I'm sure you recognize the name. He had 4 decades of maritime experience, and he'd previously commanded the RMS Olympic before taking charge of the Titanic, so he was no joke. That was a lengthy resume. Most of his crew, however, lacked the same experience. They were mostly engineers, firemen, and coal stokers, responsible for engine maintenance, along with stewards and galley workers for passenger care. In fact, only about 5% of the crew consisted of watch officers and able seamen, many of whom were newly recruited from Southampton with very little time to familiarize themselves with the ship. Think about it. It's a big ship. Well, there was a fire on one of the Titanic's coal bins that began around 10 days before departure and was extinguished on the 13th of April during the voyage. Don't want to blame the new people, but they really should have noticed that. Either way, all taken care of. And so the Titanic moved under an Arctic high-pressure system. The weather began to improve from windy and rough seas in the morning to clear and calm by the evening. Now, 14th of April, Titanic's radio operators received 6 warnings from nearby ships about drifting ice, which the passengers had already begun to notice. You see, ice conditions in the North Atlantic were the worst in 50 years for April, so definitely not a good time to be going through. But despite the warnings, the lookouts failed to spot the massive ice field ahead. The radio operators, employed by Marconi's wireless telegraph company rather than the ship, prioritized passenger messengers over the weather reports. You can see how this become a bit of a problem. And so the first ice warning received by Titanic came at 0900 from RMS Caronia, alerting Captain Smith to bergs, growlers, and field ice. Later, at 1342, RMS Baltic relayed a message from the Greek ship Athenia, reporting encounters with icebergs and heavy ice, which Smith had shared with J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line. In response, Smith ordered a course adjustment southward. However, at 1345, a message from the German ship SS America, which is a funny name for a German ship, reported 2 large icebergs nearby, but they did not reach this message to Captain Smith or the bridge, possibly due to technical issues in the radio room. Now, further warnings came from the SS Californian at 1930 and the steamer Masaba at 2140, both reporting large icebergs and heavy pack ice. These messages were missed in the Titanic's radio room, where the operator, Jack Phillips, was focused on clearing a backlog of passenger messages after equipment failures the previous day. And do remember, this is all Morse code. So people were somewhat fascinated that they could send messages from the ship. So of course everybody wanted to send one. And, well, you promise a service, you have to deliver on it. Yeah, they really should have thought about that in advance, I suppose. Well, at 22:30, there was a final warning that came from the SS Californian, now stopped in an ice field, but Phillips dismissed the message, telling the Californian's operator apparently to shut up, which isn't very nice. That's really what he said. He told him to shut up, as he was occupied with the Cape Race Station communications. Well, despite knowing about nearby ice, the Titanic continued at 22 knots, close to its top speed. This practice of prioritizing speed over caution was actually pretty common in the era, as liners operated on tight schedules and ice warnings were often seen as advisory rather than urgent. Think about it, I don't know if there's any truck drivers watching, but when they give you these crazy deadlines, well, you have to sacrifice a bit of safety. Unfortunately, it's just the way it is. There was also this. Ships would often, in those days, when they were tested and they had something to prove, if you're going to say that this ship is the best, well, obviously it needs to have enough speed. The more speed it has, the quicker it can get from port A to B, and therefore more passengers, more money. You know what it's like. It all comes down to economics. Now, many believed that these modern ships, built with all the latest technology, all the bells and whistles, could handle any collision, even with ice, just blast straight through it. After all, how big can the icebergs be? Well, after incidents like the 1907 collision of SS Kronprinz Wilhelm with an iceberg, where the ship simply completed its journey despite the damage, ice was pretty much perceived as, well, not really a significant danger anymore. Humanity has evolved. Now, Captain Smith himself in 1907, some 5 years before, had claimed that he couldn't imagine any condition that would cause a ship to sink, reflecting the confidence in the time of these new shipbuilding advancements. Well, as the Titanic approached its fateful collision, most passengers had simply retired for the night, and First Officer William Murdoch had assumed control of the bridge from the Second Officer Charles Lightoller. Lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were stationed in the crow's nest, 29 meters or 95 feet above the deck. While the temperature dropped near freezing, and the sea remained unnaturally calm. One survivor, Colonel Archibald Gracie, later remarked that the sea was as smooth as glass, and the stars distinctly reflected. Well, that is actually an indication of nearby pack ice. Unfortunately, you can use the term eerily still. A little too quiet. Well, the stillness and absence of moonlight, of course, made it difficult to detect icebergs, which might have been more visible had the sea been rougher with waves breaking against them. Now, due to a mix-up in Southampton, and believe it or not, this is true, the lookouts actually didn't have binoculars. They had gone missing, although it is debatable whether they would have actually been useful in the darkness, illuminated only by starlight, but still. Of all the times to forget your binoculars. Well, Lightoller had already warned the crew to be on high alert for ice, as those calls had been coming in all day, pretty much non-stop, particularly for smaller chunks of it that might be a little bit annoying to get past. And so at 23:30, and I will continue to use 24-hour time, Fleet and Lee noticed a faint haze on the horizon. But they dismissed it. It's probably nothing. Some experts now believe that this haze was actually a mirage caused by the temperate difference between the cold water and the warmer air, creating an illusion that raised the horizon and obscured distant objects. Maybe. Either way, 9 minutes later, 23:39, Fleet spotted an iceberg directly in Titanic's path and sounded the lookout bell 3 times. He called the bridge and informed 6th Officer James Moody, who then relayed the message to Murdoch. Murdoch immediately ordered Quartermaster Robert Hitchens to hard starboard, turning the ship's tiller to the right to steer the vessel left. That's how it was on the old boats. I'm pretty sure it still is now. It's kind of the opposite direction. You want to go right, you turn the wheel left. Now, I've never been in command of a ship that size myself, so. Well, he also signaled the full astern on the telegraphs to slow the engines. Now, Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall later reported that Murdoch explained to Captain Smith that he was trying a hard port maneuver to avoid the iceberg, aiming to first swing the bow and then the stern away from the obstacle. However, there was a delay that occurred as steam-powered steering gear took up to 30 seconds to move the tiller. And reversing engines was, well, that was a pretty complex process. The central turbine, crucial to the ship's propulsion, could not reverse, leaving the rudder less effective and hampering Titanic's ability to steer quickly. Now, if Murdoch had maintained forward speed, the ship might have narrowly missed the iceberg. Now, the lead fireman, Frederick Barrett, suggested that while the order to stop the engines was given, it might not have been fully executed before the actual collision. Well, either way, during the incident, Titanic's course was altered barely in time to avert the direct impact. However, this directional shift resulted in the vessel grazing the iceberg, which was, well, even worse than hitting it head-on. An underwater ice spur grazed the starboard side of the vessel for approximately 7 seconds, causing fragments of ice to detach from the higher sections of the iceberg and cascade into the forward decks. Approximately 5 minutes post-collision, all of Titanic's engines ceased operation, positioning the bow to the north, while the vessel gradually drifted southward in the Labrador Current. The collision with the iceberg was formerly believed to have created a substantial breach in the Titanic's hull, measuring no more than 300 feet in length and 10 feet above the level of the keel, as articulated by one author subsequently. Now, during the British inquiry subsequent to the accident, the chief naval architect for Harland and Wolff, Edward Wilding, testified that based on the observed flooding of forward compartments 40 minutes post-collision, the area of the hull exposed to the sea was approximately 12 square feet. Now, he asserted, I quote, "I believe it must have been in sections, not a continuous rupture." But he noted that many holes likely spanned an area approximately 300 feet to explain the flooding in the multiple compartments. The inquiry's findings indicate that the damage spanned around 300 feet, leading many subsequent authors to adopt this ambiguous assertion. Now, contemporary ultrasound examinations of the wreck have revealed the actual damage to the hull actually closely aligns with Wilding's assertion, with 6 tiny apertures and a cumulative area of around 12 to 13 square feet. The Titanic's hull likely sustained small, aligned gaps, the longest being about 39 feet or 12 meters, along the plate seams due to fractured or displaced iron rivets, which of course allowed water to flood in through these tiny openings. Really hard to stop. Impossible, even. Now, it was suggested by Edward Wilding during the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry, but this theory was dismissed at the time. Now, the discoverer of the Titanic, Robert Ballard, commented that the idea of the ship being sunk by such small damage was indeed pretty difficult for many to accept. Additionally, defects in the hull might have worsened the situation. Either way, fragments of the Titanic's hull plates recovered later appeared to have fractured upon impact without actually bending. Now onto the central hull of the Titanic, which used mild steel rivets in triple rows. Now, while the bow and stern were fastened with double rows of wrought iron rivets. Now, these rivets, particularly the best, or in the grading of rivets, number 3, had a higher slag content, making them more brittle and vulnerable to breaking, especially in cold conditions. Well, conditions couldn't really get much colder than the North Atlantic unless you're going to sail right through Antarctica itself, or the North Pole, rather. However, Tom McCluskey, a former Harland and Wolff archivist, pointed out that the Olympic, the sister ship of the Titanic, if you do remember, had the same iron rivets, and that didn't have a problem because it operated for nearly 25 years, despite having numerous collisions, including one with a British cruiser and a U-boat. Well, above the waterline, there were few signs of the accident. First-class dining stewards noticed a tremor, and passengers felt a jolt, compared by one survivor to rolling over marbles, though at the time they had no idea what had occurred. Those on the lower decks near the impact site felt it more directly, of course, with the engine oiler Walter Hurst waking up to what he described to as a grinding crash, and the fireman George Kemish describing a thud and a tearing noise that was along the starboard side of the ship. Of course, the chain of events was well and truly in motion now. Water began flowing into the ship violently, almost immediately at a rate of over 7 tons per second, which of course far exceeded the pumping capacity of the ship. In boiler room number 6, second engineer J.H. Hesketh and leading stoker Frederick Barrett were hit by freezing water, but they managed to escape just before the watertight door was closed. You remember those scenes from the film? Well, the one in the 2000s, I think, had a pretty good representation of those watertight doors closing. Horrifying if you did not get out in time. Of course, the engineering staff faced potential explosions as seawater flooded the boiler rooms containing high-pressure steam. The stokers and firemen worked to extinguish the fires and vent the boilers, releasing steam through the funnel pipes. But by the time they completed the task, the water had reached waist height, and they were still working as much as they could in that panicked state they were no doubt in, with the water getting higher and higher around them. How horrifying. You can only imagine it. Well, perhaps imagine it to only a certain extent. Now, onto the Titanic's lower decks, which were divided into 16 watertight compartments, separated by 15 bulkheads. These bulkheads extended at least to the underside of E deck, with some extending one deck higher. Each compartment had watertight doors, which could be remotely closed from the bridge or activated automatically by water. On the orlop, F, and E decks, the doors were manually operated. The bulkheads were designed to contain water, but as the flooding progressed, well, the fate of the Titanic became pretty much inevitable. Now, though the Titanic's watertight bulkheads extended above the waterline, they were not sealed at the top. As more compartments flooded, the ship's bow dipped lower and lower into the water, causing the water to spill over from one compartment to the next, pretty much like an ice cube tray overflowing. You know what it's like. Now, damage occurred to the ship's forepeak tank, 3 forward holds, boiler room number 6, and part of boiler room number 5, in total affecting 6 of the compartments. The Titanic was, however, designed to stay afloat if any two compartments were completely flooded. And worse comes to worst, as worse as they could have imagined, even managed with certain combinations of 3 or 4 compartments flooded, as long as it was evenly spaced out. However, unfortunately, it was more than 3 or 4 compartments. It was 5 compartments that were breached. Water would then pour over the tops of the bulkheads, leading to further flooding and making the ship sinking an inevitable outcome. And so Captain Smith, he felt the collision and immediately went to the bridge, no doubt knowing what had happened. Well, after learning of the situation and confirming it for himself, he called for Thomas Andrews, the Titanic's builder, who was actually on board for her maiden voyage on his way to New York. They quickly discovered that the forward cargo holds, mailroom, squash court, and yes, they did have a squash court, and the boiler room, number 6, were flooded, with water rapidly spilling into boiler room 5. Of course, the first question was, well, why don't we just pump it out? Well, unfortunately, as mentioned, the pumps were not sufficient to such a gargantuan task, and, well, with more water coming in, the situation just got worse and worse. Within 45 minutes, at least 13,000 tons of water had entered the Titanic, far exceeding the pumping capacity, which could only manage about 1,700 tons per hour. Andrews informed Captain Smith that with the first 5 compartments flooded, the ship was effectively doomed and had only about 2 hours left before sinking. And during the course of the sinking was round 35,000 tons of water that had flooded into the ship, almost doubling its displacement from 48,000 tons to 83,000 tons. It didn't help that the flooding was uneven, leading to an initial list to starboard as water filled over the starboard side's lower corridors. Now, the Titanic's descent angle started at 0, but reached about 4.5 degrees within the first hour of the collision. This slowdown in the sinking rate during the second hour gave passengers a kind of false hope that the ship would stay afloat longer. I mean, no one was really keen to get into the lifeboats, and do remember, everybody was told that this was the unsinkable ship. Most people thought it was just a drill. Some, maybe even a joke. Well, it was far beyond that at this point. Now, by 1:30, the bow's descent had begun to accelerate, and the Titanic's angle in the water increased to about 10 degrees. About 2:15, the sinking began to quicken drastically, with water rapidly flooding the ship's remaining sections through deck hatches, and the Titanic disappeared beneath the waves by about 2:20. So, from 12 o'clock onwards, let's get the details of how the timeline had progressed. Now, we started about 12:05 on April 15th. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered and passengers assembled on the deck. By this time, many had noticed the ship's engines had stopped and were waking up. Something was not right. Smith instructed the radio operators to send distress signals, though the ship's location was misreported by about 13 nautical miles. Water was rapidly flooding into the lower compartments, and in a desperate attempt, the mailroom staff tried to save 400,000 pieces of mail on board. Stewards lacking a public address system, had to personally wake passengers and crew, bashing on the doors, telling them to head to the boat deck immediately and without their belongings. First-class stewards assisted passengers in dressing and escorted them to safety, while those in the second and third class were pretty much left to manage on their own. Now, it didn't help either that most of the people didn't know where to go on the ship. They hadn't quite had time to familiarize themselves with the layout, so those in the second and third class were pretty confused, especially in the middle of the night. You just get woken up, everyone's panicked, something feels wrong. Well, definitely not the time to be thinking straight about where to go and save your life. It's difficult. Now, many passengers were actually skeptical of the situation, and they simply chose to remain inside, comfortable in the warmth of the ship rather than go outside and face the sub-zero temperatures. North Atlantic weather, not the best for a night walk. Few of the passengers were actually aware that the ship was really sinking, though some noticed that it was listing. Now, around 10 minutes later, 12:15, passengers were instructed to wear life belts, though many just treated it as simply a joke. Some passengers even played impromptu games on the deck with ice from the collision, kicking it around like soccer balls, Now, on the boat deck, communication was hindered by the deafening roar of steam escaping from the boilers. The noise was described as a constant, overwhelming blast, likened to the sound of many locomotives releasing steam, forcing the crew members to rely solely on hand signals. Now, what about the lifeboats? Well, all in all, the Titanic had 20 of them. And yes, it's not really enough. 16 wooden boats and 4 collapsible ones. How many was that capable of holding? Well, unfortunately, just over half the number aboard and 1/3 of the ship's capacity. All in all, 1,178 people. The lack of lifeboats wasn't due to space or cost constraints, by the way. The ship could have accommodated 68 lifeboats, but the additional cost for 32 more of them would have been about $500,000 in today's money, which was, of course, a fraction of the $7.5 million that was spent on the vessel's construction. You'd think that they would have just spent the extra money. Well, the White Star Line certainly took a reputation hit after that one. Poor decisions. During an emergency, lifeboats were designed to facilitate the transfer of passengers from the troubled ship to a nearby vessel. Consequently, it was typical for lines to possess significantly fewer lifeboats than required to accommodate all passengers and staff. Now, you see, among the 39 British liners among 10,000 long tons, 33 of them actually lacked sufficient lifeboat capacity for everyone on board. The general idea was, if the ship was sinking, it would take so long for a ship like that to go down that, well, if the unlikely event of it happening were to occur, another ship would simply hear the mayday, respond to the Morse code calls for help, or the flares fired up, eventually get there, and you would take a few trips back and forth, transporting all the passengers, and everyone would be completely safe. Well, the White Star Line aimed for the ship to feature a broad promenade deck with unobstructed sea views as well, which, well, if they were going to pepper that with continuous lines of lifeboats, that would ruin the view. So that was another reason. Which seems silly, but, well, aesthetics. Now, Captain Smith was a seasoned mariner with 40 years of maritime experience. As you said, quite a resume. And 27 of those years were spent in command of his own vessel. This was the inaugural crisis of his career, the first and the last, and he would have recognized that even if all the lifeboats were at full capacity, over 1,000 individuals would remain on board if the vessel descended, with minimal or no prospects of survival. Multiple sources subsequently asserted that upon realizing the magnitude of the impending disaster, Captain Smith was incapacitated by indecision, experienced a mental breakdown or nervous collapse, and entered a trance-like state, rendering him completely useless and inactive in efforts to reduce the loss of life. According to survivors, Smith assumed control and showed composure during the situation. Not sure who to believe. Maybe he got a second wind. Maybe originally he was a bit unsure of what to do and came to his senses. We all have weak moments at work, don't we? Now, following this incident, Smith promptly initiated an inquiry into the nature and extent of the damage, personally conducting 2 inspections below deck to assess the situation and prepare the wireless operators for the potential need to request assistance. He exercised prudence by instructing his crew to commence preparations for the lifeboats and equip the passengers with their life belts prior to being informed by Andrews that the ship was sinking. Smith was seen throughout the decks, directly supervising and assisting with the loading of lifeboats, engaging with passengers and attempting to convey a sense of urgency to adhere to evacuation directives while trying to mitigate panic. The two don't really go together. Don't panic. We're all about to sink into the freezing water. Slowly line up now, please. At approximately 12:25, 4th Officer Boxall was informed by Captain Smith that the ship would indeed submerge. However, the quartermaster, George Rowe, was so completely oblivious to the crisis that after the evacuation commenced, he called the bridge from his watch station to inquire about the lifeboat he had just observed passing by. No one really told him what was going on. Well, the crew was ill-equipped for the situation due to insufficient lifeboat training. Only a single lifeboat drill was executed, while the vessel was moored at Southampton. The endeavor was pretty superficial, involving the deployment of 2 boats, each crewed by 1 officer, and 4 men who briefly rowed around the pier for a little while before returning to the ship. Not really very practical. The lifeboats were intended to be equipped with emergency provisions. However, Titanic's passengers subsequently discovered that they had only been partially packed, despite the endeavors of the ship's chief baker, Charles Juggin, and his team. No lifeboat, or fire drills, or really any attention was paid to safety. Now, lifeboat exercise was planned for the Sunday morning preceding the ship's sinking, but of course it was a little bit too late by then, and it was annulled by Captain Smith anyway for unspecified reasons. Priorities, of course. Now, there were lists that were shown on the ship designating crew members to their own particular lifeboat stations, but few seemed to have perused them or understood or really even cared about their designated responsibilities. It was the least glamorous of the jobs. Everyone wanted to be on that first-class deck, right? Now, the majority of the crew actually lacked seafaring experience, you must remember, and some of them hadn't even had prior experience to rowing a boat. Also, many of them couldn't swim either. They were now confronted with this intricate challenge of orchestrating the descent of 20 boats, potentially accommodating a total of over 1,100 individuals, 70 feet or 21 meters down the sides of the ship. Not an easy task. In fact, one historian, Thomas E. Bonsall, had remarked that the evacuation was so poorly organized that even if they had the requisite number of lifeboats, it's inconceivable how they could have launched all of them. Now, due to insufficient time and inadequate leadership, this certainly seems to be the case. Not all lifeboats aboard the Titanic were deployed prior to the vessel's sinking. Now, around 5 minutes before all this, around 12:20, 40 minutes after the actual iceberg had hit, when the loading of the lifeboats had begun, a second officer, Lightoller, later recounted that he had to cover both of Smith's ears with his hands to communicate above the din of the escaping steam, exclaiming, "Should we not prioritize getting the women and children into the boat, sir?" To which the captain acknowledged with a nod. Smith subsequently instructed Lightoller and Murdoch to embark the women and children and lower the lifeboats. The two policemen construed the women and children evacuation directive differently. Murdoch understood it as prioritizing women and children, whilst Lightoller interpreted it as exclusively women and children. Lightoller deployed lifeboats with vacant seats in the absence of women and children awaiting boarding, whereas Murdoch permitted a restricted number of men on board once all the adjacent women and children had been embarked. While both officers were uncertain about the safe capacity of the boats throughout their descent and opted for caution by refraining from filling them to capacity. Their full complement of 68 individuals might have been safely lowered, particularly given the exceptionally favorable weather and water conditions. As stated, it was very flat on that night. Had this action have been executed, an additional 500 individuals could have been rescued. However, hundreds of individuals, primarily men, remained on board, as lifeboats were deployed with numerous seats unoccupied. Initially, few passengers were inclined to board the lifeboats, and the authorities overseeing the evacuation encountered challenges in persuading them. Now, remember that millionaire, John Jacob Astor? Well, he is quoted as saying, "We are more secure here than in that small boat." Well, it just goes to show, don't have to be a genius, don't you? Several passengers categorically declined to board J. Bruce Ismay, seeing the gravity of the situation, traversed the starboard boat deck, imploring passengers and personnel to embark on the lifeboats immediately. So a stream of women, couples, and single men were convinced to enter starboard lifeboat number 7, which was the inaugural lifeboat to actually be sent down. Now, at 12:45, lifeboat number 7 departed from the Titanic, carrying about 28 passengers, although it had a capacity of 65. Lifeboat number 6, located on the port side, was subsequently lowered at 12:55. Now, there were 28 individuals on board, including the famous unsinkable Margaret or Molly Brown. Sure you've heard the name before. Lightoller recognized that only one seaman was present on board, being Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, and solicited for volunteers. Major Arthur Godfrey Puchan of the Royal Canadian Yacht Club advanced and descended a rope into the lifeboat. He was the sole adult male passenger permitted by Lightoller to embark during the portside evacuation. Now, if you have seen the movie A Night to Remember, which was, I think it was in the 70s, perhaps the 60s, a movie about the sinking of the Titanic, which I believe is better than the version with DiCaprio and Rose Winslet. They do a very good job of this scene in particular. In fact, it's the most accurate film you can see. You owe it to yourself, even just for these little bits that they have throughout the movie, just adding to the authenticity. Well, either way, go watch a damn movie. Anyway, Puchan's action just shows this significant issue during the evacuation, that there was pretty much a scarcity of seafarers to operate the boats. The staff should have been trained. Well, some individuals were dispatched below to open the gangway doors for the evacuation of further passengers, but they did not return, which is a bit ominous. They were likely ensnared and submerged by the ascending water beneath the decks. Well, at the same time, additional crew members struggled to sustain essential services while water essentially flooded through the ship's lower decks. Engineers and firefighters endeavored to release steam from the boilers to avert explosions upon contact with cold water. Just another problem added to the mix. Now, they reopened watertight doors to instill additional portable pumps in the forward compartments in a futile attempt to mitigate the flooding, while keeping the electrical generators operational to provide lighting and power throughout the vessel. Now, there was one steward, Frederick Dent Ray, who narrowly escaped being engulfed when a wooden partition between his rooms and the third-class accommodations on E-deck collapsed, submerging him up to the waist in water. At approximately 1:20, survivor trimmer George Cavell reported that the water commenced flowing into the boiler room number 4 from the metal floor plates below, potentially suggesting that the ship's bottom had been breached by the iceberg. The influx of water rapidly beyond the capacity of the pumps necessitated the evacuation of the boiler room by the firefighters and trimmers, staying there till the last moment. Now, that's just the job, isn't it? Well, multiple reports suggest that they maintained their position right to the very end, so guaranteeing the operation of Titanic's electrical systems until the final moments, ultimately perishing within the ship's depths. No way out. Locked in the hot boiler rooms. God, I suppose there's no good way to go in that situation, but that to me just seems so horrifying. Well, of course, all 35 engineers and electricians on the ship died. None of the 5 postal workers were observed after they were last spotted attempting to salvage the mail bags they had retrieved from the flooded mail room. They must have been ensnared by the ascending water on D deck. Well, a significant number of third-class passengers encountered the spectacle of water inundating their cabins on decks E, F, and G. Now we have a quote from one of them, Carl Jansen, who, along with a limited cohort of the third-class survivors, subsequently recounted. And this is from his testimony. Then I ran down to my cabin to bring my other clothes, watch and bag, but I only had time to take the watch and coat when the water with enormous force came into the cabin, and I had to rush up on the deck again, where I found my friends standing with lifeboats on and with terror painted on their faces. What should I do now, with no lifebelt, no shoes, and no cap? Well, the lifeboats were deployed every few minutes on both sides. However, the majority was significantly under-occupied. Number 5 departed with 41 passengers. Number 3 had 32. Number 8 with 39. Number 1 with only 12 out of a capacity of 40. Disgraceful, isn't it? And the evacuation proceeded ineffectively, resulting in accidents and injuries among the passengers. A woman fell between lifeboat number 10 and the ship's side, but an individual grasped her ankle and pulled her back onto the promenade deck, where she successfully boarded on her second attempt. The first-class passenger, Annie Stengel, had multiple rib fractures when a German-American physician and his child sprang into number 5, crushing her and rendering her unconscious. Of course, the general descent of the lifeboats themselves was equally perilous. Number 6 was almost flooded during its descent into the water emanating from the ship's sides, but it successfully distanced itself from the vessel. Now, number 3 narrowly avoided catastrophe when one of the davits became lodged, endangering the passengers by risking their ejection from the lifeboat into the ocean. By 1:20, the gravity of the situation became evident to the passengers on the upper decks, who commenced bidding farewell, with husbands accompanying their wives and children to the lifeboats. Distress flares were discharged at regular intervals to capture the attention of any vessels that were nearby, while the radio operators, they were still incessantly transmitting the distress signals to anybody who could listen. Now, radio operator Harold Bride advised his colleague Jack Phillips to utilize the SOS signal, as it may be the final opportunity to transmit it. Contrary to Bride's belief, SOS was not a novel signal, as it had been utilized numerous times previously. The two radio operators communicated with other vessels to request aid. Multiple vessels answered, with RMS Carpathia being the nearest at a distance of about 58 miles. Well, the problem is that Carpathia was significantly slower than the Titanic, and even if she was operating at maximum speed, which was about 17 knots, it'd take 4 hours for her to get to the ship. You can see how this is a problem. But it wasn't the only vessel. There was another to respond, the SS Mount Temple, which charted a course toward the Titanic, but was unfortunately impeded by pack ice on the way there. Well, the SS Californian was significantly closer, having alerted the Titanic to the presence of ice a few hours earlier. Concerned about his vessel becoming ensnared in a vast expanse of drift ice, Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian resolved about 2,200 hours to cease navigation for the night and await the daybreak to navigate through the ice field. At 23:30, 10 minutes prior to the collision with the iceberg, the Californian's only radio operator, Cyril Evans, deactivated his equipment and just went to bed. Who knows what it would have turned out like if they'd have kept it on. Well, on the bridge, the third officer, Charles Groves, observed a huge vessel to starboard around 10 to 12 miles distant. It executed an abrupt maneuver to port and came to a halt. Had the radio operator of the Californian remained at his station for just an additional 15 minutes, numerous lives could have perhaps been saved. Well, shortly thereafter, Second Officer Herbert Stone observed 5 white rockets detonating over the stationary vessel. Now, he had stated to a colleague that a ship would not launch rockets at sea without justification, but this was ignored. At this stage, it became clear to those on board the Titanic that the ship was indeed going down, and there were not enough lifeboats for everyone. Some still held on to hope, such as Eloise Hughes Smith, who had reportedly pleaded for her husband Lucian to accompany her in the lifeboat. Of course, this is not allowed, and when Captain Smith ignored the request, Lucian told her, "I'll make sure that you get into the boat." Well, despite the reassurance, he perished. Tilly Tosig was forcibly separated from her husband Emil and placed into Lifeboat 8 with her daughter, while Selene Jasbeck tried to return to her husband as their boat was lowered. Charlotte Collier's husband, Harvey, urged her to board, telling her to find courage, but he, too, unfortunately did not survive the ordeal. Some couples chose to remain together, such as Ida and Isidor Strauss, co-owners of Macy's, who decided to sit in deck chairs and face their fate together. Once again, this is very accurately represented by the film A Night to Remember. That is the only homework I will give you. Also, the industrialist Benjamin Guggenheim changed into formal attire, stating that he wanted to die like a gentleman. Most of the people who made it onto the lifeboats were, of course, from first and second class. There were very few third-class passengers that managed to escape, with many trapped in a maze of passageways or behind gates that separated them from the upper-class accommodations, a regulation intended to control immigration and disease transmission. Think about it. Spanish flu, that sort of stuff. Well, there were a few years before Spanish flu, but tuberculosis, typhoid, this sort of thing. Those sorts of worries of that time. Now, the third-class cabins were also the furthest away from the lifeboats, which made their escape difficult, especially for passengers who didn't speak English very well. Many survivors credited their lives to steward John Edward Hart, who made several trips below deck to guide passengers to safety. Others found their way to the deck through open gates or emergency ladders. Some of them, possibly overwhelmed by the situation, one can hardly blame them, made pretty much no effort to flee and simply remained in their cabins or gathered in prayer in the third-class dining area. Chief Fireman Charles Hendrickson observed throngs of third-class passengers in the lower decks, accompanied by their belongings seemingly awaiting direction. The psychologist Wynne Craig Wade links this phenomenon to a kind of stoic passivity created by generations of directives from social superiors. August Wennerstrom, a surviving male steerage passenger, later remarked that many of his fellow passengers had made no attempt to save themselves. He wrote, in his account, "Hundreds were in a circle in the third-class dining saloon, with a preacher in the middle, praying, crying, asking God and Mary to help them. They lay there and yelled, never lifting a hand for help themselves. They had lost their own willpower and expected God to do all the work for them." By 1:30, The Titanic's descent angle was augmenting, albeit not exceeding 5 degrees, accompanied by a growing list to port. The worsening circumstances were evident in the communications dispatched from the vessel, i.e., "We are evacuating the women in the boats," at 1:25. "Engine room is flooding," at 1:35. And at 1:45, "Engine room is flooded to the boilers." This was Titanic's final coherent signal, transmitted as the vessel's electrical system commenced to function. Ensuing communications were garbled and incomprehensible. The 2 radio operators persisted in transmitting distress signals till the conclusion, as long as they could. The remaining boats were packed to near capacity with growing urgency. Number 11 exceeded its rated capacity by 5 individuals. As it descended, it was nearly inundated by water being expelled from the actual vessel itself. Number 13 nearly evaded the same issue. However, those on board were unable to detach the ropes from which the boat had been lowered. It floated backwards, exactly beneath number 15 as it was being lowered. The cables were severed promptly, allowing both vessels to depart unharmed, but certainly a close call. The initial indications of panic emerged when a contingent of male passengers endeavored to hastily board portside lifeboat number 14 as it was being lowered with 40 individuals on board. 5th Officer Lowe, responsible for the boat, discharged 3 warning shots into the air to manage the gathering without inflicting harm. I'm sure that certainly stopped the panic. Nothing calms people down more like shooting a gun into the air a few times. Number 16 was reduced 5 minutes subsequently. Among the passengers was stewardess Violet Jessup, who also survived the sinking of Titanic's sister ship Britannic 4 years later during World War I. The collapsible boat C was launched at 1:40 from a predominantly vacant starboard section of the deck, since the majority of individuals present had relocated to the stern of the vessel. It was on this vessel that J. Bruce Ismay, chairman and managing director of White Star, the most contentious survivor of the Titanic, fled the ship, an action subsequently denounced as cowardice. Of course, you meant to go down with the ship, right? At 1:40, lifeboat number 2 was deployed. At deck level, Lightoller discovered the boat occupied by men whom he later described as neither British nor of the English-speaking race, but belonging to the broad category known to sailors as Dagos. It's not very nice, isn't it? After he expelled them by brandishing his empty revolver, he could not locate sufficient women and children to occupy the vessel, and he ultimately lowered it with just 25 individuals aboard, despite a capacity of 40. As for John Jacob Astor, he bid farewell to his wife as she departed for safety on lifeboat number 4 at 1:55. But he was denied access by Lightoller, despite the fact that 20 of the 60 seats on this lifeboat were actually vacant. The final boat released was Collapsible D, departing at 2:05 with 25 individuals on board. 2 additional men boarded the vessel while it was being lowered. The water had inundated the boat deck, and the forecastle was submerged. First-class passenger Edith Evans relinquished her position in the lifeboat and ultimately perished in the catastrophe. She was among just 4 women in the first class who actually died. The rest made it onto boats and went on to live very happy lives Good for them, I suppose. Well, multiple survivors, including the third-class passenger Eugene Daly and first-class passenger George Rames, assert that they witnessed an officer shoot one or two of the individuals during a scramble for a lifeboat, thereafter turning the weapon on himself. There were rumors that Murdoch was that officer. Now, of course, these rumors sort of got, well, blown out of proportion a little bit. You'll know that the modern retelling of the Titanic, the one with DiCaprio in it, have that one officer who shoots the guy and then shoots himself in the head. So, whether that was true or not, most people sort of have that image in their head now because of the film. Now, Thomas Andrews was reportedly last seen in the first-class smoking room around 2:05, seemingly just sitting there, having a smoke, resigned to his fate. However, there are alternate accounts that suggest he may have been seen earlier around 1:40, helping passengers to evacuate. He was allegedly observed throwing deck chairs into the ocean to aid those in the water, and possibly heading to the bridge in search of Captain Smith. Now, as for Captain Smith, meanwhile, he was conducting a final check-over of everything, and finally told crew members that it is now every man for himself. It's not what you want to hear from the captain. Well, he instructed the team launching collapsible boat A to do their best for the women and children before he returned to the bridge, where he is believed to have gone down with the ship. Some, like Harold Bride, claim to see Smith going overboard, but once again, in all the darkness and panic, who really knows? As the stern became the final gathering point for many, Father Thomas Biles, a second-class passenger, gave confessions and granted absolutions, while Titanic's band played outside the gymnasium. The ship had two distinct music groups, a quintet led by Wallace Hartley, and a trio, each performing different roles aboard the ship. After the collision, the bands were reportedly called to play in the first-class lounge to calm the passengers down. Contrary to popular belief, there is no evidence that the band moved to the deck. Edward Brown, a steward, recalled seeing them at the top of the stairs near the first-class entrance, but that's about all we've got in that regard. Now, there is a well-known part of the lore around the Titanic that the band played Nearer, My God, to Thee as the ship went down. There are a few different opinions about this. Though it is debated, the story became so connected with the tragedy that the hymn's notes were inscribed on bandmaster Wallace Hartley's gravestone. Archibald Gracie, a survivor, dismissed the claim, saying he didn't recognize any hymn at all. But Harold Bride later reported hearing Autumn, possibly referring to the popular waltz Song of Autumn. The bandmaster of the rescue ship Carpathia, George Orrell, shared survivors' recollection that the band initially played more lively tunes to try and brighten the mood a little bit, but eventually, as things became a little bit more somber, switched to hymns. And, well, that included Nearer, My God, to Thee, but we don't know whether that's the final one. Gracie recalled the band playing cheerful tunes until they ceased about 30 minutes before the sinking. However, a first-class passenger by the name of A.H. Barkworth mentioned seeing the band playing a waltz at first, but later observed that they had discarded their instruments. It is possible that the musicians briefly paused to don life belts before resuming their performance. Well, around 2:15, The Titanic's angle in the water began to escalate swiftly as water inundated previously unflooded sections. The abrupt elevation of her angle resulted in what one survivor described as a giant wave sweeping over the ship from the bow of the boat deck, submerging numerous individuals. The individuals attempting to deploy collapsible lifeboats A and B, including 6th Officer Moody and Gracie, were carried away along with the two vessels. Boat B capsized, with Bride trapped beneath it, while Boat A became partially inundated and had its canvas unextended. Bride and Gracie survived on Boat B, while poor old Moody did not. Lightoller, having endeavored to deploy collapsible B, recognized the futility of proceeding aft and subsequently leaped overboard from the roof of the officers' quarters. He was drawn into the ventilation shaft, but was expelled by a powerful surge of hot air emerging beside the overturned lifeboat. The forward funnel collapsed under its own weight, fatally crushing several individuals, including first-class passenger Charles Dwan Williams, who were struggling in the sea as it descended and nearly missed the lifeboat. It narrowly missed Lightoller and generated a wave that propelled the boat 50 yards away from the sinking vessel. Those aboard the Titanic noticed that her structure was trembling as it endured significant strains. Now, according to first-class traveler Jack Thayer, occasionally there had been a muffled thud or deadened explosion within the ship. Now, without warning, she seemed to start forward, moving forward and into the water at an angle of about 15 degrees. This movement, with the water rushing up towards us, was accompanied by a rumbling roar, mixed with more muffled explosions. It was like standing under a steel railway bridge, while an express train passes overhead, mingled with the noise of pressed steel factory and wholesale breakage of china. Eyewitnesses observed the stern of the Titanic elevating significantly as the vessel descended into the ocean. It was reported to have attained an angle of 30 to 45 degrees, revolving seemingly around a center of gravity just aft of midships, as articulated by Lawrence Beasley subsequently. Numerous survivors recounted a significant noise, which some ascribed to the explosion of the boilers. Beasley characterized it as a combination of a groan, a rattle, and a smash. It was not an abrupt roar like an explosion, but rather persisted for several seconds, possibly 15 to 20. He ascribed it to the engines and machinery detaching from their bolts and bearings and descending through the compartments, obliterating everything in their path. Now, just one thing about the angle of the ship. Now, do remember, it was a moonless night. Sounds like I'm starting a short fiction. Well, but it was a moonless night. Visibility is not the best. So you have pretty much zero visibility because at this time the lights had gone out. And the people who were in the lifeboats observing it, well, it took a while for them to figure out if it was actually the case that the ship had went up on that angle. They simply just could not observe something and confirm it. Well, it is believed now that it did, from the multitude of people who did say that they saw it, but some said that they didn't. So, there's that. Well, after an additional minute, the ship's lights actually flickered once, and then went out completely, which enveloped the Titanic in pure darkness. Jack Thayer remembered observing the clusters of the 1,500 individuals remaining on board, clinging together like swarming bees, only to descend in masses, pairs or individually, as the stern of the ship, measuring 250 feet, ascended into the sky. As the Titanic neared its final moments, the ship experienced immense opposing forces. The weight of the flooded bow pulled it downward, while the air in the stern buoyed it upward. These forces concentrated at a structurally weak area near the engine room hatch, ultimately leading to the ship's snapping and breakup. After all the lights went out, the Titanic split apart. The bow remained briefly attached to the stern by the keel, causing the stern to rise before the two sections fully separated. The bow then submerged quickly, while the stern floated momentarily before sinking completely around 2:20, approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes after the collision with the iceberg. Well, in the immediate aftermath of the sinking, numerous individuals were left grappling in the frigid sea, encircled by wreckage from the vessel. The Titanic's fragmentation during her plunge to the ocean below resulted in buoyant debris, including timber beams, wooden doors, furniture, paneling, and cork fragments from the bulkheads, ascending to the surface. Some swimmers were hurt and maybe killed. Others utilized the debris to maintain buoyancy. Well, at a temperature of -2 degrees Celsius, that's 28 Fahrenheit, by the way, the water was lethally frigid. Lightoller articulated the sensation of 1,000 knives stabbing into his body. Sudden immersion in freezing water like that usually results in death from hypothermia within minutes, or due to cardiac arrest, the whole shock of it, involuntary water inhalation, or cold shock. Nearly all individuals submerged in such conditions succumb to cardiac arrest or physiological responses due to the freezing water within 15 to 30 minutes. In fact, only 13 individuals were assisted into the lifeboats, despite having the capacity for over 500 additional occupants. Well, of course, this chaotic scene of the individuals in the water, all screaming and crying and yelling, was a profound shock to the occupants of the lifeboats, many of whom had until that time believed that all had evacuated prior to the ship's sinking, rather, soon realized that that was not the case. Well, one survivor articulated the cries arrived like a thunderbolt, unforeseen, unimaginable, astonishing. All individuals on the boats suggested that a few hundred yards away must have experienced the overwhelming shock of realizing that an incomprehensibly tragic event was unfolding, one that they could powerless. Could not mitigate any of it. Well, among the few survivors in the water were Gracie, Jack Thayer, and Lightoller, who reached the overturned collapsible boat B. About 12 crew members were already aboard, rescuing as many as they could, until roughly 35 men were clinging to the overturned hull. Fearing the boat would capsize under the weight of more swimmers, they paddled away from those still in the water. Gracie, in his account, praised the men in the water for their bravery, noting that none reproached the crew for refusing to help, and even heard somebody shout, "Good luck and God bless you." Some say that this might have actually been Captain Smith, but who really knows? Well, some swimmers did make it aboard the collapsible boat A, which was upright but partly submerged, forcing the occupants to sit in freezing water for hours, causing many to die from hypothermia. Meanwhile, other boats, many with empty seats, stayed nearby, debating among themselves whether to go back for swimmers. Of course, there's always the risk that you be swamped and then everybody goes down with them. Now, boat number 4 closest to the sinking ship rescued 2 men from the water, while 7 others were saved later, though 2 died shortly after. But most of the lifeboats, including collapsible D, opted not to return, of course expressing concern about the inevitable passengers wanting to get on board and capsizing the lifeboat. Unfortunately, those sorts of decisions have to be made. So, the RMS Carpathia rescued Titanic's passengers at approximately 4 a.m. on the 15th of April, having navigated through the night at high speed and at significant peril, as they too had to evade multiple icebergs along the way. And when you're going at that high of a speed, well, everybody's on high alert. The lights of the Carpathia were first observed at around 3:30, which significantly uplifted the survivors. However, it required several further hours for all individuals to be rescued on board. About 30 of the men from Collapsible B successfully boarded 2 additional lifeboats. However, one survivor perished shortly prior to the transfer. Collapsible A was in distress and nearly submerged. A significant portion of individuals on board, possibly over half, had actually perished overnight. The passengers aboard the Carpathia were astonished by the sight that unfolded at dawn. Expanses of ice, upon which, like the features of terrain, lay countless ice pyramids. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia observed ice in all directions, including 20 substantial icebergs reaching heights of up to 200 feet, along with several small icebergs, ice floes, and remnants from the Titanic. Carpathia's passengers perceived their vessel to be situated within an expanse of white ice, punctuated by icebergs resembling distant hills. Well, with that, of course, we perhaps do a video on the response and the subsequent court proceedings that happened after the Titanic sank, but I think we can leave it at there for the moment, with that image of the broken survivors looking out upon those vast swaths of ice out there in the ocean. It's a horrible thought. Well, I will thank my top-tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Gary, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, and Fizarbo. Thank you very much for supporting, and I will see you in the next video. Keep warm now, if you can. Good night, everybody, and rest in peace to everybody who lost their lives in that horrible, horrible disaster. Lots of love to you all.